So my name is Roy O'Connor. I'm a research ecologist with the Agricultural Research Service. And I want to acknowledge my colleagues on this, Chad Boyd, Joe Smith, and Dave Noggle. And so let's talk about carbon in the Great Basin. I was kind of the odd duck. I didn't go biome, and that was because of some mapping products that are now available with this special issue that I will be able to incorporate further. But let's talk about this. So carbon is a hot topic, right? And we hear a lot about sequestration, right? And that is how much the process of capturing, storing carbon through either photosynthesis or through geologic formation of weathering and calcium carbonate formation in the soils, okay? So that's one way. The next is storage. These are your pools of carbon on the landscape, okay? This is how much is contained, a known quantity. And it's usually measured in mass per unit area or volume, okay? And that's another area that people are talking about, all right? And then there's security. And this is a term that I've developed that I think we need to start implementing on rangelands. And it's the ability for a site to maintain its carbon over time. Okay, so the first one is a constant rate of going in and out of the system. The storage, it can be going in and out of a system, but the security is we're thinking about how it's going to stay there over long term, and it's an index, okay? And so for the carbon security index, we're looking at, yes, it's a vegetation index, based index. I'm not actually measuring carbon because we are lacking a lot of information on soil carbon in rangelands, okay? There's a lot of initiatives happening so that we can calculate that carbon, but it's not there yet. And besides, managers can't manage soil carbon, right? It's really hard. Like, how are you going to change a gram per meter squared of carbon? But we can manage vegetation, okay? And so we have this vegetation index that we're incorporating where we're looking at a preferred vegetation based off of your area. A fire probability is a negative, it gets penalized in the model because we're trying to avoid fire disturbance. And then we're using Gene Chambers' resistance and resilience theory into this as categories to help separate and delineate areas of security in the landscape. And these values can be positive up to +2. And that means you have potential for sequestering carbon and storing it, but you're securing it over that time frame, okay? And then you have, it can be negative. It can go down to -2. And that's your loss of stable carbon over time, okay? And that's dictated based off of those disturbance values and your vegetation on the site. And I want to make this analogy of penny stocks versus treasury bonds, okay? So a penny stock, it's volatile in the markets. You rarely receive your return on investment. And companies often go bankrupt. So you're losing those future opportunities, and it's unsecure, okay, over time. Whereas a treasury bond, it's extremely stable, okay? You always receive your return on your initial investment. You may not make a whole lot, but you're receiving that return, and it's secure, okay? So for a penny stock on the landscape for carbon security, that's our annual grasslands, okay? You're losing carbon in that. We have research that shows that we are losing carbon in our landscape if it converts to annual grassland. The other hot topic is trees, okay? Conifer expansion or planting trees in rangelands or allowing trees to expand into rangelands. You're also having a very volatile security on that, in that you're just waiting for that next fire to happen, or you're waiting for that next massive rainstorm to hit and erode that carbon off of the landscape and transport it someplace else, and so it's lost at your location. Whereas a treasury bond, this is your core areas that we've been talking about. You have sagebrush, you have perennial grasses, okay? But it can also be without sagebrush. You can have these perennial grass-dominated sites that are in high resistance and resilient areas. A fire occurred, but they were able to respond biotically to that disturbance. And so this starts to separate my model out from SEI, but we can use them concurrently to improve what we can see. So in looking at carbon security index across the Great Basin, in 1989, when we started getting really good satellite data, our CSI value was about 0.8 across the Great Basin entirety, okay? And that's in blue. So the more blue the site is, the higher the security. The redder the site goes, the less secure the carbon is on the landscape. But in 2020, so almost 30 years later, right? A little over 30 years later, we've decreased to 0.29 in carbon security. So what does that mean? Well, we lost 53% of our secure carbon in our landscapes over that time frame. Okay, and that matches up with what we've been hearing about in this special session, where we're seeing large decreases on our landscape, and that's driven by vegetation. Okay, that's driven by our annual grasses. That's driven by our conifer expansion and our disturbances. Okay, when we look at this in comparison to SEI, okay, our core areas, they are stable. Okay, we're not losing our carbon security in those areas. Right, our growth areas, they're fairly stable as well. Okay, we lost 8% since 1998. Okay, that's not a whole lot, and that's also going along with what we're seeing with the other data. Our other rangelands, fortunately, we're losing a lot. We've decreased it by 67%. Okay, when it comes to other rangelands. All right, and that shows that carbon security isn't, it's following these same trends. It's allowing us to also add a layer to our management plans. If we want to look at how does this relate to fire disturbance, I used a 2012 Holloway fire to look at this in relation to R&R. There are R&I sites on that. And using a change point analysis, we found that 2 to 3 years prior to the actual fire, we were seeing that transition point to where we're losing our security on our site. Okay, and this shows that carbon security is spatially and temporally dynamic at different scales. So that means if we have a restoration effort, we can start seeing potentially how our security is going to be changing at those restoration sites. And because, an index is great, but it means nothing, what's the difference between 0.2 and 0.4? What's the difference between 0.01 and minus 0.01, right? We had to create something that was usable for everyone. And so I created this management map that helps prioritize areas based off of the distribution of the data of the index. And areas that are green, that's where we could have a stable carbon security. We need to protect those areas. And if you overlay this with the SEI map, they're going to fall within those spots. But they're also going to be just outside of them in areas that may have been labeled as other because they lost their sagebrush component from the SEI model. And so now you can start connecting some more areas to preferentially select for habitat restoration or for sagebrush planting designs that allow it. And so it's another layer for our management plans, okay? We need to secure our carbon from loss. We need to maintain these areas because if you lose the vegetation, you're losing your carbon inputs. This is not meant to replace soil carbon sampling. That is a necessity that we need to have on our landscape to be able to talk about that ecosystem service. But it's easier to manage our vegetation. Those are the inputs going into our carbon in our soils. And this allows us to add another layer onto our conservation of rangelands. So we have our ecological integrity down here at the bottom. We can stack carbon security on top of that. Then we can say sage grouse habitat. We can add that layer, forage quality, and other layers. And then when you have a management design for a site, you can look at all of these layers combined and you have a much stronger plan for your restoration or for your management of a location. And with that, thank you.